Bom dia, pessoal. Tudo bem? Vamos começar primeiro com o vídeo institucional do NIC.
Já imaginou se você não tivesse seu direito à liberdade de expressão respeitado? Se seus dados particulares fossem divulgados sem autorização? Ou se você tivesse sua navegação filtrada por causa de interesses comerciais? A liberdade de expressão, a privacidade e a neutralidade da rede são fundamentais para a internet. E esses são apenas alguns dos 10 princípios formulados pelo Comitê Gestor da Internet no Brasil. O CGI.br promove há mais de 20 anos a internet no país. Graças a ele, você tem constante inovação, segurança e diretrizes para o desenvolvimento da internet. Isso tudo é feito de forma colaborativa, transparente e democrática. O comitê é formado por representantes de todos os setores da sociedade. Assim, as decisões são tomadas por meio do diálogo, com a participação de todos os membros, até que um consenso seja alcançado. Por esses e outros fatores, o modelo brasileiro de governança se tornou referência no mundo todo. CGI.br, por uma internet cada vez melhor no Brasil.
Quando você registra um domínio .br, você está contribuindo para a melhoria da internet no Brasil. Pois cada domínio que usa o .br é registrado pelo NIC.br, o Núcleo de Informação e Coordenação do .br, que além de registros de nomes de domínios, investe em análise e tratamento de incidentes de segurança, projetos de tecnologias de redes e operações, pesquisas que trazem indicadores sobre o uso das tecnologias da informação e comunicação, implementação de pontos de troca de tráfego local na internet, projetos que contribuem no desenvolvimento global da web e muito mais. Tudo isso porque o NIC.br é uma entidade civil de direito privado e sem fins lucrativos, que mantém uma estrutura de registro de domínio segura, estável e de confiança, e reverte parte do que você paga pelo seu domínio no desenvolvimento de infraestrutura, trazendo benefícios para todos que usam a internet no Brasil. Toda essa inovação, tecnologia de ponta, segurança e infraestrutura só é possível porque você tem um domínio .br. NIC.br, sempre em busca do melhor para a nossa internet.
Bom, pessoal, sejam muito bem-vindas e muito bem-vindos ao último dia do 16º Seminário de Proteção à Privacidade e aos Dados Pessoais. Essa edição em que comemoramos os 15 anos do seminário, desde a criação do evento. O meu nome é Loriane Marie Schippers, eu faço parte da equipe de assessoria ao CGI.br e também da organização do 16º Seminário. Eu gostaria desde já de agradecer o engajamento, a audiência e a presença de todo mundo nesses últimos 2 dias de debates intensos e de celebração. Lembramos que este evento é uma realização do Comitê Gestor da Internet no Brasil e do Núcleo de Informação e Coordenação do .br, em parceria com o Ministério Público Federal, a FGV Direito São Paulo e o Capítulo Brasil da Internet Society. Agradecemos também o apoio da Autoridade Nacional de Proteção de Dados, o IPREC, a LANA, Artigo 19, Associação Brasileira de Propriedade Intelectual e Data Privacy Brasil. Antes de iniciar formalmente nossas atividades, alguns avisos protocolares. Seguimos com a transmissão ao vivo no canal do NIC.br no YouTube e também temos a tradução simultânea das atividades que estão acontecendo nesse salão principal. Hoje, nossa Keynote fará sua apresentação em inglês e, aos presentes, é possível pegar os aparelhos de tradução simultânea ao lado do credenciamento. As perguntas ao longo da programação de hoje poderão ser enviadas por meio de um formulário acessível por QR Code, que será mostrado na tela, e o link para realizar as perguntas também será compartilhado no chat do YouTube. Por meio do QR Code, é possível marcar uma opção caso desejem ser chamados ao microfone para ler sua pergunta. Nos painéis com microfone livre, as perguntas podem ser feitas também pelo chat do YouTube. Recomendamos, por fim, que não deixem itens de valor na sala, especialmente nos intervalos mais longos de cafés e de almoço. Hoje, a nossa programação se mantém na temática de Privacidade e Proteção de Dados Pessoais, mas começa a fazer uma ponte com o evento de amanhã, o segundo seminário do Observatório Brasileiro de Inteligência Artificial. E fica aqui o nosso lembrete e convite para todos participarem. Começaremos o último dia com o Keynote, Justiça de Dados e Tecnologias Emergentes, implicações a partir da ciência de dados, com Renée Cummings. Em seguida, após o almoço, voltaremos com o painel Sandbox Regulatório e Inteligência Artificial, seguida do painel Proteção de Dados Pessoais em IAs Generativas. Por fim, teremos a nossa sessão de encerramento. Seguimos com os vídeos em celebração aos 15 anos do Seminário de Proteção à Privacidade e aos Dados Pessoais, com o próximo a seguir.
A gente percebe que com o desenvolvimento de tecnologias, como por exemplo a inteligência artificial, existe um grande debate, uma grande preocupação em relação à proteção da privacidade e dos dados pessoais. A gente ainda não sabe muito bem o caminho regulatório que vai ser tomado no nosso país no que diz respeito à inteligência artificial, por exemplo. Nós temos hoje um projeto de lei em andamento na Câmara dos Deputados que trata da regulação da inteligência artificial, que traz princípios que são muito semelhantes aos princípios trazidos na Lei Geral de Proteção de Dados Pessoais, mas, ao mesmo tempo, a gente tem aí toda uma questão em torno da tecnologia que ainda não é muito bem avaliada ou compreendida. Então, eu acho que o papel do seminário, né, e das próximas edições do seminário vai ser justamente identificar como essas tecnologias emergentes, e aí eu estou falando da inteligência artificial mais especificamente, podem, de alguma forma, ou tutelar, né, a privacidade, a proteção de dados pessoais, ou seja, sejam instrumentos que permitam o desenvolvimento e a proteção desses direitos fundamentais, e como também avaliar os impactos e os riscos que essa inteligência artificial traz eventualmente para esses direitos. E aí é uma questão da gente analisar de fato como esse equilíbrio pode ser alcançado. Então o seminário tem esse papel muito importante de fazer uma investigação de como as tecnologias emergentes podem impactar esses direitos fundamentais. É uma forma da gente pensar em como os direitos humanos podem ser protegidos frente a essas tecnologias.
Passamos agora para o nosso Keynote, Justiça de Dados e Tecnologias Emergentes, implicações a partir da ciência de dados, com Renée Cummings, da Universidade de Virgínia. Renée, se puder subir ao palco.
Of course, you know, I'm not understanding anything that you're saying.
I know.
What do you want me to do? Sit, stand?
Também peço para a moderadora do painel, Bianca Kremer, conselheira do CGI.br, se juntar a nós no palco. Apenas a título de informe, as perguntas deste painel serão feitas na modalidade de microfone aberto no momento em que a moderadora abrir o espaço. As introduções mais completas serão feitas na sequência pela moderadora. Bianca, a palavra é sua.
Obrigada, Loriane. Bom dia a todas, todos. Para mim é uma alegria imensa moderar esse painel e ter a felicidade de poder contar com o keynote de uma profissional da monta, da Renée Cummings. Uma professora que tem despendido esforços nos últimos anos na área da criminologia, justiça de dados, com uma sólida contribuição, não só na academia, mas também no ativismo e na sociedade civil, para impactos positivos, para pensarmos ética e inteligência artificial, né, com um recorte de coibição da discriminação, mitigação de vieses e pensar caminhos possíveis para diversas ferramentas relacionadas ao uso dessas tecnologias, das novas tecnologias. Para mim é uma alegria que o CGI.br possa ter contado com o trazimento da presença de uma profissional como a Renée, como eu mencionei. Eu acredito que os trabalhos e as pesquisas que a Renée Cummings tem desenvolvido nos últimos anos vão muito ao encontro dos problemas contemporâneos que estamos enfrentando aqui no contexto brasileiro, né? Em diversas frentes. Compartilhamento de dados públicos, por exemplo, agora com minutas de decretos novos do Ministério da Gestão e Inovação relacionados ao uso de dados públicos dentro da administração, a ampliação do uso de ferramentas de inteligência artificial, não só para persecução penal, mas para toda a cadeia de investigação criminal, com novas portarias do Ministério da Justiça, que acabaram de ser desempenhadas e trazidas, para trazer diretrizes sobre o uso de dados em investigações criminais no contexto brasileiro, e não só o uso de dados, mas o uso de tecnologias de inteligência artificial também nesse processo, e aspectos sobre ética, inteligência artificial, explicabilidade, levantamento e uso, aplicação de inteligência em dados para processos de tomada de decisão, públicos e privados. Hoje nós estamos em um momento muito mais avançado do tratamento de dados pessoais e da aplicação de legislação em matéria de tratamento de dados pessoais no contexto brasileiro do que estivemos nos últimos 5, 10 anos. Desde o advento da Lei Geral de Proteção de Dados, nós temos cada vez mais, ano a ano, amadurecido nossos debates. Mas, com o amadurecimento dos debates, temos também novos desafios. Então, eu acredito que as pesquisas e os saberes da Renée Cummings podem trazer e engrandecer muito as nossas reflexões também no contexto brasileiro para dar conta de diferentes cenários e diferentes tecnologias que, de maneira cada vez mais complexa e muitas vezes também pervasivas, têm atravessado a nossa sociedade. Então, eu gostaria muito de passar a palavra para a querida Renée Cummings, agradecer mais uma vez pela honra de podermos contar com a sua presença, com a sua expertise, e agradecer mais uma vez por sermos agraciados com a sua fala, com o seu retorno ao Brasil, já que há 2 anos atrás você esteve já em Brasília, já participou de seminários também no Supremo Tribunal Federal, abrilhantou o debate no contexto brasileiro, e é uma honra e uma alegria poder contar com você mais uma vez nesse momento, nessa nova etapa que o Brasil enfrenta em matéria de privacidade e proteção de dados pessoais e desenvolvimento e uso de sistemas e ferramentas de inteligência artificial. Muito obrigada, Renée. A palavra é sua. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Good morning. Let me say it's an absolute honor and a pleasure to be with you. As Bianca said, this is my second time in Brazil. I was here in 2023. The Supreme Court was looking at questions around algorithmic decision-making and how bias and discrimination were being baked into the algorithms that were being used for judicial decision-making. So this conversation that we are going to have is really a continuation of the questions around data, AI, power, the ways in which we are thinking about the data power structure, the ways in which we are understanding the benefits of data in enterprise, the ways in which we can develop real-time excellence with data, but also an understanding that where data is being used, there are questions of exploitation, questions of erasure, questions of exclusion, and of course, the biggest question, the question of extraction and the question of colonization when it comes to understanding the impact of data. So, power, and this is where we're going to begin. Data is now considered the greatest geopolitical game changer globally. Every country, as you know, rightfully so in Brazil, because you have really been leading the way when it comes to understanding questions of data governance and questions of data sovereignty, and much of the ways in which Brazil is thinking about data centers data justice as the nucleus of much of your policy. We know that globally, every country is interested in data. We've heard who owns the data owns the world. Data is now our DNA. Data is now the new oil. Who has the data is going to make the decisions. We also know there is a concentration of data power, now AI power, and we also know that there is no AI without data. When we think about data, and we think about who owns the world's data, we know there is a monopoly around data, and we know that monopoly exists in the global north. The fact that every country, every government, every leader, every CEO, every manager is talking about data speaks to that power. How powerful is data? How did data become this powerful? What is data being used for? Why is our data being extracted and packaged and repackaged and repurposed and sold and traded and stolen? What is it about this thing called data that someone, an organization, an agency, an entity, a group would want access to it? Access that they would actually do something criminal, like stealing that data, like hacking. So I want you to think about data, and I want you to think about it within the context of power. And when we think about data, we're thinking that this thing called data is now creating an invisible war, where individuals, agencies, countries are trying to exploit, trying to extract, trying to get this commodity. And when we think about this data war, it's not happening with boots, it's not happening with tanks, it's not happening with the kind of ammunition that we're accustomed seeing, but it's actually happening with something that is even more powerful than those arsenals that are being used for war. So who owns it? Who owns data owns the world. Who owns data is now governing this very invisible but powerful terrain. Like every empire, data comes cloaked in promise, because we speak about the promise of big data, but we know that promise often leaves behind the weight of loss. Think about it. 2021 in your own country, Brazilians' personal data on sale online, a nation exposed. When we think about data, data is as powerful as it is as vulnerable. So we have something that's so powerful, something that everyone wants, something that is now governing the ways in which we think, we engage, we interact, the ways in which we are thinking about development, the future, how do we co-create, and this very, very powerful thing is also very, very vulnerable. It's open to attack. If it gets in the wrong hands, if it gets in the hands of bad actors, this very powerful thing becomes something that is very deadly. So where there is reward, there is risk. Where there is power, there is peril. And where there is the ability to design an extraordinary future with data, there's also the danger of what data can do. Think about the health ministry, a website being hacked during COVID, and that data being extracted, and that data is being sold. We don't really think about our data. We use technology, and we need data. Data has been really working to help us solve some of the world's greatest challenges. I consider myself a critical data scientist. For the last decade, I've been speaking globally about big data ethics, but I also spend a lot of time with CEOs in the C-suite, with design teams, helping them tweak and create very bespoke models when it comes to using data. We know this powerful thing is vulnerable to bad actors, and we know if we don't have the requisite regulation, the real-time governance, and the enforcement that is required, we know the danger of data. So it is fantastic, but it is also something that we have got to protect. When we're thinking about data, we're also thinking about what data extracts. As a criminologist, criminal psychologist, and a terrorism expert, I spend a lot of time looking at data within the context of policing, law enforcement, national security, defense, the ways in which we are thinking about terrorism attacks. And one of the things we have realized is that data is extracted from very strange places. And many of the times, our own engagement with data comes from a place of often fun, often entertainment. We're using our phones. We're surfing the internet. We're engaging with friends on Facebook. We're posting about our fabulous lives on Instagram. We're sharing the things that we are doing professionally on LinkedIn. We are putting up things on TikTok. We are downloading. We are purchasing on Amazon. And we are doing everything that we need to do, and we are sharing our data in ways in which we are not even thinking about. Most people who purchased an Alexa never thought about the fact that an Alexa could be subpoenaed by the courts, could become a part of a police investigation, and could be used against you, as we have seen in several cases in the U.S. when it came to domestic violence and, of course, homicide in the home, that the Alexa was forever on, collecting that data, collecting those voices, and that information being extracted. Now we're talking about brain data. And the fact, when we think about neurology and neuropsychology, we are seeing that the data in our brain, our thoughts, our memories, our processes, how our frontal lobe is making executive decisions, could be data that's extracted, not just for healthcare, but it could be for criminal justice, to see how someone was thinking before they perpetrated a crime. So we have got to think about how data is being extracted. And many individuals using these home DNA tests never envisioned that their data would become part of police data. So when you think about data and you think about how you're using your data, you've got to be very, very strategic. So data is about possibilities. Data is about how do we use this information to make the best public decisions that we can. We know that data is about insight, data is about foresight, data is about insight. When we're thinking about how we use that data, we can get the best information, we can forecast, We could reimagine just about every business model. We can enhance and reimagine, reposition, redefine just about every discipline and every industry. Look at these fantastic photos. Look at what's happening when we think about data in manufacturing and the kinds of advancements that we are seeing when it comes to real-time excellence, when it comes to reimagining and repositioning these business models of excellence that companies are using to profit. When we think about agriculture, and we think about e-agriculture and AI-infused agriculture, we're seeing some great things. We are. But we're also seeing job losses. We're seeing an impact on the labor market. We're seeing women impacted because these jobs that women often have done are now being taken away from them. We know data is about entertainment. When we think about how we can exist in a virtual world, when we think about augmented reality, mixed media, and the kind of excitement we are seeing when it comes to film, and when it comes to the entertainment industry, when it comes to our ability to use a GPT and put in a prompt and come up with a video. Advertising agencies, marketing agencies, anyone dealing in this digital advertising sphere in which we now exist can tell you about the power of data to really ensure the possibilities of a wider, greater experience. But with that possibility comes the concern. The concern where there is excellence in manufacturing, there is also exploitation, where we're seeing something like farming. We're thinking now of questions of erasure, of certain groups no longer having jobs, certain communities unable to fulfill particular legacies. So where there is excellence, there is exploitation, there is extraction, there is exclusion. We need to always think of that balance. So as we move on, I want you to just think about two things here. During COVID, many of the instruments that were being used, particularly in the US, to really measure the levels of oxygen were not tested on diverse data sets. And it was only after COVID, doctors at a particular university in the US, where the oximeter was designed and developed and used, realized that they never tested those instruments in its building phase on black and brown skin. And what it was really doing was giving an inaccurate reading that led to the death of many individuals during COVID. So when we think about health data, we think about even something like the vaccine rollout that happened globally, and some communities being impacted in very real ways. Urban and rural communities not getting the kind of access to the vaccines as, of course, wealthier communities. So when we're thinking about data, we know the possibility is grand. We know the possibility is extraordinary. We know the possibilities are beyond our imagination, because many of us are yet to really, truly imagine what we can do with this technology. But there are concerns, there are risks, and there are dangers that we need to speak about. We also speak about prosperity. We know when we think about our sustainable development goals, when we think about the development of our countries, when we think about the fact that data is now being used to answer some of the world's most challenging questions around climate, around food security, around industry, around biodiversity. We're seeing the spectacular things that we can do with data, the algorithms that we can build, the ways in which we can deploy very bespoke AI to treat with many of these challenges. But where there is prosperity, there are also concerns. Who's prospering? Who's benefiting? Who's getting the profits? When you think about big tech companies, And you think about the fact that some of these companies that were designed for very, very basic social engagement now have the ability to determine, define our identities through a digital interface. And when we think about the power that these companies hold, when we hear things like Facebook is now $1 billion company, what did Facebook use to become $1 billion company? What was Facebook selling? Us. Everything about us. Everything that we shared, our lives, our parties, our recipes, our fashion, our engagements, where we shopped, where we dined, where we went to church, our academic achievements. We were tagging our friends who we had not seen since high school. We were sharing our location, and we were doing these things because we wanted to engage more. We wanted to interact. Some of us may be looking for other ways in which to socialize, not knowing when we first interacted with that technology that our data was being extracted, that our data was being exploited, and that data would now be monetized by someone else, by an agency, and that data would also be sold and shared and traded like a commodity. So when we're thinking about prosperity, we know that data can do some great things, but we've also got to understand that data could do some very bad things. So prosperity for who? Who's benefiting? What are the long-term impacts? What's being taken away from us? What's the trade-off that we are making every time we interact with technology? This extraordinary promise, the promise of collaboration. I am very committed to AI. I'm very committed to the ways in which we could innovate intelligence. I'm very committed to the things that we can do with data, how we can press AI into service, collective imagination, collective intelligence, the ways in which we can augment intelligence. Very, very important. This is the future, and this is where we're going, and I'm definitely a part of that. But where there is that promise, technology has under-delivered. Recent study released a few days ago showed that many companies were not using generative AI, and those companies that were using generative AI have not profited or have not benefited. It shows that the technology has helped us on a personal level, on a social level, has made a lot of us feel more efficient. ChatGPT makes a lot of us feel more creative, more exciting, more intelligent. Now we can whip up a poem in real time. We probably never wrote a poem in our lives, and now we are looking like poets as we are sharing information with friends. We're doing business models, and we're coming up with new business strategies. But where there is that promise for a future, and a very exciting future, you've got to also ask yourself about the power, about the ways in which this technology may be undermining the things that we hold dear. So where there is that promise, there is also this question of how pervasive the technology is. And I always say it, most of us do not know, as we are sitting in this room, an algorithm and many algorithms are making decisions about us. Decisions about who we are, how we think, what we are worth, what type of access we should get, what type of resources we are going to have access to. And it's not making a decision only about us today. It's also making a decision about us that's probably going to last about 5 years. I always say the data has a memory. Data has a memory beyond its computation. Data carries with it a history that carries and carries and carries, given the challenges that we are seeing with historic data sets, particularly in criminal justice. and mortgages and loans and credit scores and education. We are seeing the challenges of historic data. When we think about how pervasive data is, we are there, we are using data, we are using our technology, we are engaging with this technology to make ourselves better, to enhance what we are doing, to reimagine the world that we want to live in. But are we thinking about the interface? Are we thinking about what we look like on the other side of that computer? How many people know what their digital and their data identity looks like? Anyone would like to take a guess? What we look like as data points. And that's something we need to think about, because this technology, data, and algorithms do not allow us to change our minds. When that data is extracted and that data creates a profile, that profile is moving and moving and moving with us. There's the question of agency, the question of autonomy, the question of self-actualization, and the question of self-determination. Those are things that we don't think about, but it's happening every time we click, every time we share, every time we tag. We are giving so much of ourselves, of our person, of our identities through data, not knowing that these data sets, these models that are being designed, as much as they may be able to support the kind of growth we need to see as a collective, they also have the ability to be weaponized against us. And when we think about progress, it's something we hear over and over again. Data is about progress. Data is about development. Data is about attaining those goals that we have set for ourselves and our country, sustainable development goals, and all of these things are real. But at the same time, who is participating in designing this technology? Who is participating in the ways in which the technology is developed and deployed? When we think about data, when we think about AI, we've got to ask ourselves that question about participation, that question about public oversight, that question about who's governing the technology. How much of a voice do we have in the governance of this technology? What about our communities? What about the ways in which we are thinking about community-inspired, data-driven technology, or community-inspired artificial intelligence, or artificial intelligence that is being built by the people and for the people, something we call public interest technology? Technology that's being built in the interest of the public. We've got to think about all of this as we are thinking about progress, because we could be moving forward, but going nowhere. We could be moving forward, but moving backward at the same time. We've got to think about progress, but we've got to think about it within the context of how are we profiting from our data, or who is profiting from our data? Who is experiencing the progress? And this is the thing about data. You may be in a country, and you may find in a country, you may not be part of that data set or that community that's become vulnerable or that's being victimized or marginalized. But then as a country, you are now part of a data set that assumes you are the global south, and assumes that nothing important comes from the global south. Because when we speak about data, we speak about data in terms of the global north. We know the 5 biggest companies in the world when it comes to data, and you could name them, exist where? In the United States. We know that China is having a very vigorous move for that title. We know that Africa is trying to think of ways in which they need to decolonize the kind of colonization they are seeing with data and AI in their space. And we know that India is thinking about data governance and data provenance and data localization and how to keep their data within their borders. But we've got to think about that progress. And you've got to ask yourself, who's moving forward? Who is profiting? Where are the communities situated? Very, very important. And the question of privilege. Privilege is a very major question when we think about data justice. because privilege situates who's included and who is excluded. Privilege is about representation. Who is represented in the data sets? We know when it comes to healthcare data, particularly in the United States and in Europe, what we see is a underrepresentation of Black and brown communities. We see an underrepresentation of diversity. We see the lack of inclusion, and we see these challenges undermining equity in healthcare. And what happens? Misdiagnosis, underdiagnosis, communities that are not being diagnosed, communities that are being rejected. So when we think about privilege, we've got to think about that question again about power. And who holds the power decides who is privileged, who is going to be privileged to a particular kind of access or a particular kind of resource, or who is going to have the ability to have a particular kind of dream, a particular kind of future. So we must think about representation. Of course, there's the question of prejudice. And we continue to see that in many of our data sets, particularly when we speak about criminal justice, when we speak about policing, when we speak about profiling, when we speak about data that's being racialized. This is a 2016 case, ProPublica in the US, and this was pivotal in expressing and exploring and pushing into the mainstream the question of machines bias, the question of risk, the question of how do we mitigate the risks that we are seeing in our data sets? How do we detect those risks? How do we mitigate those risks? How do we manage those risks? And how do we take all of that information and enhance the process? And what this shows is data in the United States, in the criminal justice system, historical data that created these risk scores. And in the United States, we have been using algorithms for about 25 years to determine sentencing, to look at questions around public safety, to look at questions around parole. Who leaves the prison system and who stays? And this was very basic. These two juveniles, very misdemeanors, small crimes, petty crime. This young man was for shoplifting. This young woman picked up a scooter and rode it about 2 blocks past her house, left it there and ran away. And when they went to court, her risk to public safety was 8. His risk was 6. When you look at the violence here and when you look at the violence there, you ask yourself, what was that data thinking? And what that historic data was thinking is that it is carrying a memory of criminal justice that says that certain groups are more criminal than other groups. The data that was being used was data points for bias because they were using the data sets of where they lived, their zip codes, whether their families owned property, whether they had a home phone or a landline, as opposed to these other individuals who may have come from communities in Florida where they actually came from a family that owned property, that owned a home. And when you think about the ways in which data points are used and weaponized against us, we've got to think. And this is about, I mean, I'm not pinpointing Facebook, but over the last few years, Facebook is where many of our examples of doing data dangerously have come from, and the ways in which we never knew that those photographs that we were sharing were going to be extracted and were going to be used for targeting in facial recognition and other types of technologies. This is also a test case in the US. This gentleman by the name of Robert Williams was at work when his wife called him and said, the police are at the house, they want you, they are here to arrest you, could you please come home immediately? He's driving home from work and he's thinking it's a prank. He's saying this has to be a joke, what are you talking about? She said, the police are here. They have photographs of you shoplifting watches at a high-end store in a mall in Detroit. The man is clueless. He really thinks this isn't happening. He gets to his home, he's arrested in front of his children, and of course he's taken to the police station, the police precinct, and he stays there for about 15 hours until one of the police officers decided to look at his driver's license and compare it to the images from facial recognition and CCTV and realize this is not the man. In the meantime, he lost his job, had to secure a lawyer. Well, actually, the American Civil Rights and Civil Liberties Union took up the case. It took a few years. He eventually got $250,000, but this became the test case for facial recognition and policing. And of course, the Detroit police had to go back, think about questions around data ethics, remove facial recognition technology from the ways in which they were using it, and really think about data ethics and data justice and the ways in which we're thinking. And when we think about policing and the things that we are doing now with algorithmic policing, we're seeing the EU's AI Act that does an exceptional job in really highlighting the levels of risk, says we do not need algorithms in policing. We do not need to deploy algorithms against migrants. We do not need to deploy algorithms in spaces where we can have social services as opposed to police services. We need to really rethink how we're doing that. And the question here is, are we creating new stories with technology? Or are we creating new technology to perpetrate old stereotypes? And it's something that we need to think about. And really, this just is an example of what was happening with Clearview and a very similar case here in Brazil. The question of democracy, very important to data justice. When we think about democracy, we're also thinking about our rights, about data rights. But when we think about democracy and data, we're also thinking about disinformation, distrust, the ways in which we are now accessing information, the fact that many of us believe that the information that we're accessing is real time, is the information that we want. But what we're seeing in democracy is really the weaponization of data. And this is one of the biggest cases, Cambridge Analytica, and what Cambridge Analytica did in several countries. And we saw it, you experienced it in 2018, it made big news here. We know that in 2016, the US spoke about it extensively as well, and the ways in which data can do an extraordinary good job for democracy, but it can also undermine our democracy. And then there's this question of data and pain, which is very, very dear to me, and it's something that we don't think about. And it's something that I really introduced into sort of the lexicon of data science. And it's called data trauma. And many individuals have experienced data trauma. And it's really the psychological, emotional, and social harm caused when data, rooted in histories of oppression, surveillance, and systemic bias, is misused, weaponized, stripped of context, leading to the re-traumatization of individuals and communities across generations, intergenerationally. So when we talk about erasure and extraction and exploitation of data, we're talking about the fact that different communities have historically experienced data differently. And it's very, very real. So data trauma occurs when people are reduced to data points, denied agency over our digital identities, or harmed by data-driven or algorithmic decision-making systems that echo past injustices. Data trauma is just not technical. Its effects ripple through memory, identity, and trust. And these are big questions for communities, because what we continue to see with data is bias, discrimination, marginalization, profiling, victimization. These are all very, very real when we think about data trauma. And of course, we've got to think about these data-driven decision-making systems that we continue to use. And the fact that many of these systems are uneven in the ways in which they deal with racial, economic disparities, this question about marginalization, and as well this question of systemic racism. These are real, very, very real. So as we finish up this presentation, data is about people. Data is about personhood. Data is about who we are. We need data. We need data for everything that we are doing if we are existing in the world today. I love data. I spend a lot of time with data. I spend a lot of time thinking about data, a lot of time helping people use their data more efficiently. I do a lot of work in forecasting, looking at insight and bringing that oversight when it comes to the ways in which we are thinking about data. But we've also got to think about people. And are we using data as a form of liberation, as a form of us truly getting to explore who we are, as a form of us truly getting to engage with the world in which we need to engage? Are we having equity in our engagements? Are we having equity in our access? Are we having equity when it comes to the resources that we are getting? And it's a very, very real question. And this is where protection comes in. Data governance, compliance when it comes to companies, when it comes to enforcement and ensuring that the laws that we have in place are swift, are certain, are severe to deal with individuals who undermine our human rights and our civil rights and our dignity. Data is a question of dignity. Data is a question of respect. And this is why it needs to be protected. We knew the EU, GDPR, set the standard. We know the EU now has its EU AI Act. And we also know that there's something very spectacular that comes out of Brazil when it comes to the conversation about data and data governance, and of course, questions around equity and inclusion and diversity, and how do we protect data, how do we protect our citizens, and how do we build with data, but build with the due diligence, build with an understanding of due process, fairness, and justice, and build with an understanding of duty of care and ethics of care, understanding those questions of dignity and those questions of personhood. And of course, always being ethically vigilant when we are using data. And it comes back to public education. It comes back to public information, because good public education and good public information makes even better public oversight, which is critical to data governance, which is critical to data justice, which is critical to equity. And equity is about competitiveness. Equity is about ensuring we all have access, we all get a piece of the pie. And when we think about our future, we know that data is being used to build algorithms. We know algorithms is being used to build AI, and we know that AI is the future. We're talking about superintelligence. But we also know that data and algorithms and AI are socio-technical instruments, because they really rearrange our social relationships, and we're seeing that. And it's really informing the future of society. And what it's calling for is interdisciplinary thinking. What do we need to do when it comes to data governance and data justice? We need to have what I call an interdisciplinary imagination. So as a critical data scientist and a data science professor, we see in particular that data must intersect with sociology and criminology and history and every otherology that there is out there for us to get the best results. Data is not standalone. I always say, I'm a criminologist and criminal psychologist, and I always say to my students, you interrogate data long enough, and it's going to confess to anything you want it to confess to. That's data. But you have got to understand the power of data. You've got to understand how powerful it is and the fact that it is pushing our future forward. But you've also got to understand it needs an interdisciplinary approach to get the best out of it. It needs that interdisciplinary imagination to ensure we are doing what we need to do with it for social good, for the future of good. We are bringing that ethical vigilance into the space, because it all comes down to legacies. What is the legacy that you want to build using data? And the funny thing is this, with data, we're seeing questions around ageism, and with data, we're seeing children being born, and their future already exists in the data that defines their families, their communities, their countries. And we are seeing now that we are even dreaming in data. But for many countries in the global south, our data infrastructure is not even owned by us. Those cables, those clouds. So we could be dreaming in a country, and our dream is now owned by someone else. And the big question is, what is the legacy you want to leave with your use of data? What is the narrative and the story you want to tell with your data? When we are long gone from here, and you may know that a very big topic right now in data is the question of data in the afterlife. What happens to our data when we die? And it's something that scholars are thinking about. It's something, of course, lawyers are thinking about. Do we bequeath it to someone? Do we leave our data to someone? Does someone have access to our data when we're long gone? Are people using our data to make decisions that may be weaponized against our own family, our own children, or our grandchildren, the grandchildren we never know we had, sort of grandchildren? We've got to think about how that data is being used. And why I think about all of this and what I will say is just a few things. If you're using data, these are the things, and I'm going to end right here, that you need to think about always. Of course, you need to think about the risks. Of course, you need to think about detecting, mitigating, and managing those risks, and of course, improving your systems. But you've got to always think about accountability, transparency, explainability, fairness, questions around accuracy, questions around auditability. How are we auditing the data that we're using? How are we auditing the algorithms that we're using? What kind of impact assessments are we using? What sort of stress testing and red teaming are we doing to ensure that our algorithms are not going rogue, or that our data is now sort of flaccid and doesn't have the kind of punch that it needs? You've got to think about all of that. You've got to ensure that the work that you're doing with data is non-discriminatory and it's not biased. Because when we think about data and we think about AI, and I'll say it one final time, there is no AI without data. You need data. Data is the lifeblood of everything we're doing in AI. And the reason we need to think about data within the concept of justice, and the reason we need to think so strategically about data, because it's not only about us. I always say data ethics is not only about us. It is critical about us and to who we are. It's also even more important to those we have never met and those we are going to leave behind. And with that, I thank you very much.
Muito obrigada, Renée.
So this is the part where I always get confused because I don't know what she's saying.
Thank you very much, Renée. Bom, depois de uma palestra fantástica como essa, gostaria de fazer algumas perguntas breves à Renée, introdutórias, e, num segundo momento, abrir o microfone para as perguntas do público, tanto presentes quanto online. Mas antes de fazer essas perguntas, só para fazer uma pequena conjuntura com o nosso seminário dessa palestra, a Renée falou sobre as possibilidades e o equilíbrio com o desenvolvimento de novas tecnologias e o processo regulatório. Ela falou sobre questões controversas de prosperidade. A Renée falou sobre a pervasividade ou a possibilidade de usos pervasivos de dados. E algo que ela trouxe, eu tenho para mim que é uma das maiores contribuições que nós podemos trazer para pensar proteção de dados pessoais e, principalmente, falando um pouco da minha área, a sua conversa com o direito civil brasileiro, que é a sua tese de data trauma, o trauma, né, movido por dados, que afeta 3 elementos essenciais, né? Memória, identidade e confiança. E eu não poderia me furtar de não casar um pouco essa fala da Renée dentro. Por isso que eu acredito que a A interdisciplinaridade enriquece tanto as nossas respostas para os problemas que nos são tão comuns e, às vezes, nós nem nos damos conta. Nós temos aqui, Renée, uma professora chamada Caitlin, está aqui à frente, e ela tem trazido também questões, aspectos de responsabilidade civil para o campo das novas tecnologias. E, para isso, ela tem escrito trabalhos que têm conjugado 2 instrumentos, né? O dano injusto e o princípio da solidariedade social. Quando nós vemos os impactos dos dados a partir de uma tese construída como a sua, eu vejo como isso pode enriquecer para o campo dos direitos digitais, para as nossas construções teóricas de ampliação do conceito de solidariedade social, de respostas de responsabilidade, para aspectos de accountability, transparência, prestação de contas. E aqui no Brasil, é o que vocês chamam de liability, né? Vocês têm 2 palavras para falar sobre o que nós entendemos como responsabilidade, né? Que é liability e responsibility. E aqui nós usamos tudo como uma palavra só. E eu acredito que isso ajuda muito a enriquecer esse cenário. Então, te agradecer profundamente sobre as suas trazimento de questionamentos. Tenho certeza que os seus incômodos são os mesmos dos nossos. Então, para isso, eu queria já iniciar fazendo uma primeira pergunta e te ouvir, mais uma vez, um pouco mais, sobre processos antidiscriminatórios do uso de tecnologia. Já que o nosso painel é sobre justiça de dados, eu queria entender como é que nós fazemos ações concretas para grupos vulnerabilizados como um todo, pessoas negras e indígenas, comunidade LGBTQIAP+, aspectos relacionados a grupos vulneráveis em geral, né? Podemos incluir idosos, crianças, mulheres, né? Então, vou fazer a pergunta em inglês, mas especificamente sobre processos de biometrias, para compartilhar contigo uma coisa interessante. Hoje, no Brasil, para receber benefícios sociais do governo, a biometria foi estabelecida por lei em obrigatoriedade para os nossos grupos vulneráveis, que são majoritariamente pessoas negras no nosso país. Então, eu queria te fazer essa pergunta, que eu vou fazer em inglês, mas só para fazer o contexto para as pessoas. How can we consider anti-discrimination actions for vulnerable groups from the perspective of data justice applied to the processing of biometric data for public safety purposes, investigations, and criminal decisions? And we can add, actually, as well, for social benefits as well, if you want to address a little bit more. Thank you so much.
Sure, a fantastic question. And I will begin my answer saying that the first thing we need to do is reimagine the meaning of vulnerable. And I mentioned it a bit in the presentation. So we think about vulnerable groups often would be groups, let's say Black and brown communities in the States, or maybe Afro communities here, indigenous communities. But you also remember is that you may not be in a vulnerable group in Brazil, but now when your data is dealt with externally, you become a vulnerable group because we know what the world thinks about data from the global south. The world believes that global south data is not data of real importance. The data that they want is that Western, sort of American, European data. So immediately, you're in a vulnerable group. And as we move through life, we become members of vulnerable groups. So we may be young today, we are old tomorrow, and then we are facing ageism because of those algorithms. So vulnerability is a word that oftentimes used with a lot of safety when we think about who is vulnerable or who's not vulnerable. What AI is teaching us is that we are all vulnerable. Each and every one of us in this room, our data is being used for things we have never imagined. Our data is being traded, it is being sold at the moment like a commodity. Many of us may not even know that our data could be enslaved at this moment, doing things that we never expected it to do. That's when we think about data. That's when we think about the work of data brokers and these data cartels. The criminal justice system is now creating profiles for these companies that scrape the internet, that steal data, profiles that are very similar to terrorist organizations, through gangs, through illicit organizations, and that should make you think. Now, when it comes to biometrics, we've got to put a stop on that. Biometrics sounds easy, right? It's an easy, we can use our face, we could use our hand, we could use our eyes. But we've also got to think about these things. If I came to you and I said, my dear, you look so spectacular, could I borrow your eyes? Are you going to give me those eyes? No, you're not, right? But that's your biometrics, right? That's your data. If I said to you tonight I want to do something illicit, can I just use your fingerprints for 10 minutes? What are you going to say to me? Lady, you're crazy. What is wrong with you, right? Exactly. So when we think about data, we've got to break it down. And I know it sounds funny, but the thing is, it's funny until it's sad. Your data is an extension of who you are. Your data is an extension of your personhood. We have been using technology for so long, and we have been giving. Our data is the gift that never stops giving, because every day we are using technology, every day we are giving of ourselves. And if someone was to bring you a readout of your data for the last 15 or 20 years of your engagement with technology, we would be afraid of ourselves. We use the internet, we use Google, we use ChatGPT to often ask the most intimate questions about ourselves, our families, each other, our health, our financial situation, our education, the things that make us concerned about who we are, the things that make us afraid of this world, the things that concern us about our children, the things that we may see that we don't understand. The first thing that we do is we go to technology, oftentimes privately, to get an answer. Think about all the private and the intimate things you have shared in the space of data. And it comes back to that question of biometrics. And what we're seeing with biometrics is that biometrics can do some great things. And we know in financial services, it really works good with fraud detection. The fact that we're seeing it work in healthcare when it comes to pain management, and patients who are having strokes and heart attacks are able to use their phone and their biometric, and we're seeing real exceptional research when it comes to precision. But then there's the other side, the sad side, where we know that biometrics are used to track, to trace, to terrorize, to traumatize communities and groups. And what that biometrics also does, it undermines people's legacies, because what you're doing is you're creating a profile that's not going to change. You're creating a profile that denies access, denies resources, and you're saying who's included in certain things and who are going to be excluded. So with everything that we're seeing with data, there is the reward and there's the risk. And it comes to how strategic and oftentimes how creative, how imaginative are we when it comes to balancing the reward and that risk, but always understanding that there are rights. And we have a responsibility to each other to ensure we uphold what is the best of this technology and match it to the best of humanity.
Thank you, Renée. Eu queria abrir o espaço do microfone para perguntas. Para quem desejar fazer perguntas, nós vamos aceitar perguntas aqui do público presencial e também online. Então, eu vou aproveitar... Bom, já temos aqui as pessoas encaminhadas para o microfone. Então, eu vou abrir o microfone para que vocês possam fazer suas perguntas, já que o nosso tempo está encerrando. E vou pedir para vocês se identificarem, para o nome de vocês, de onde vocês vêm, e que vocês possam direcionar as perguntas à Renée. Vou fazer 2 presenciais, por conta do tempo, e uma online. Então, pode ficar à vontade.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Marcos, from Coelho Lima Law Firm. Ms. Cummings, I would like to thank you for your knowledge to share with us. So if you don't mind, I'm gonna ask in Portuguese, I think is better. Nós temos aqui no Brasil a filósofa Marilena Chauí, da qual ela fala sobre uma mudança de subjetividade causada pelas redes sociais. O uso das redes sociais tem causado uma mudança, né? Um comportamento narcisista, e todo narcisista é gera um comportamento depressivo, causado, sobretudo, pela dependência do olhar alheio. Eu queria ouvir você sobre isso, porque quando você estava falando sobre a difusão dos dados, você falou que os dados não estão, os big data não estão autorizados a mudar nossa mente por causa do tanto que compartilhamos com eles todos os dias, enfim. Queria te ouvir sobre isso, e é isso. Thank you.
Maravilha, muito obrigada. Oi, Cláudio.
Good morning, Ms. Cummings. An honor to hear you. Thank you for a very insightful and also inspiring speech. We saw notes frantically being taken over the audience. I think that's the best sound of what we have done here. I'm Claudio Lucena. I'm a professor at Paraíba State University and also sitting currently at the National Data Protection Council in Brazil. I used to say to my students that we used to talk about data that we have, while now the right approach is to talk about data that we are. So I think this changes the game. I want to ask you about one dimension that was not explicitly taken in your presentation, which is the dimension of time. Byung-Chul Han says that democracy does not fit in the time frame that we're building in the digital society. It needs reflection, it needs time, it needs maturing, and we do not have this time in the data economy that we have created today. And the second question, I'm coming from an underserved region in Brazil, so there is an asymmetry within the country of how we deal with data governance, data structures, and data solutions. So I think it's not a very different scenario from the United States. Digital inclusion metrics and indicators are different in California than they are in Wyoming. So when you think about solutions for the issues you have brought, how do you see them spanning across regional asymmetries like there is in the United States? Thank you very much again.
Obrigada, Cláudia. Vou passar a palavra à Renée para que ela possa fazer as suas respostas.
Oh, fantastic. Two absolutely fantastic questions. I'll speak about the narcissist question first, and you are quite correct when you espoused that perspective and the kind of fascination with self that this technology is creating. There are several scholarly works that look at the question of particularly data and algorithms and AI and social media creating an extraordinary amount of anxiety, this thing called the anxiety generation, and how people are dealing with it or how young people are not dealing with. And for a very long part of my life, I often move between the sociology and the psychology. So a very good time of my life, I was in private practice as a psychologist, and I still do work in that realm, and you're quite correct. Because now when we're looking at the notes that psychologists and social workers and psychiatrists keep, there's one person that keeps coming up in all of that question, and that's, social media. Social media has impacted people in a way that has never been imagined. When we think about identity, when we think about self-identity, when we think about how young people are thinking about themselves or not thinking about themselves. And I will say this to you, 10 and 20 years ago, for someone who was in college, just getting an A was sufficient for you to feel accomplished. I continue to meet young people who are getting A grades and they're not looking happy. And when I say, what's going on with you, it's like, I don't have 100,000 followers, right? So the world has changed. We forsake something like an A grade for likes or for being an influencer, whatever that means at the moment. And it's also a very critical question to this whole idea of this narcissistic thing that we're becoming, and that subjective approach that has been changed. So when we think about data, we know there's nothing neutral about data. Data is being used in every facet to tell a story and to get a reaction from you. So when we think about social media, we know what those algorithms are doing. We know those companies know what those algorithms are doing. And we know those companies allow those algorithms to toe the line and to push the envelope and to go in places because they are continuously extracting that data. Because the thing about AI is this, and if there's one thing that's constant about AI is that the developers, the designers, the deployers, all of us do not truly understand the capacity of this technology. And it comes back to the GPTs and the hallucinations and why it is the data is doing things that even the computer scientists and data scientists do not understand why the models are behaving. So the thing about your question is that it's so brilliant, it doesn't have an answer, because we are now living the answer. So maybe in about 10 years, the researchers and the scientists and the social scientists will give us the answer to your question, because in truth and in fact, we're the experiment, we're the research. When it comes to, Professor, your question about democracy, you're quite correct. When I speak, and I spoke about it, I speak about real-time governance. And there could be another word for that, but it's a family event, so I'm not going to use that word, right? Because you just said it. It's about the fact that governance is not happening in the time, democracy is not happening in the time that it's supposed to happen. We know that the law is always behind the technology. We know the technology is designed in ways in which it creates these extraordinary loopholes and drops these veils and these blinds. It's like when we're accessing a new app, right? We click, and we click, and we click, and we click to the end. I accept, I accept, I accept, I accept, I accept. Okay, you would think it was a series of marriage proposals. It was not, but we go through this thing and we accept everything, and when we accept it, we do not have a clue what was said. There was a research study that was done, and I think the study, do not quote me, the study said, for us to truly read the user agreement on our phone, it will probably take us about 3 months. So the fact of the matter is the companies know that none of us is taking the time to read that. And it doesn't, when we use all these different apps, we're not thinking about that. And you're quite correct. How do we respond to something that's moving so quickly? Democracy is really no test for the speed and the scale of this technology. But what do? We can't throw our hands up in exhaustion. We can't stand wringing our hands, looking as though, we don't know what to do. We've got to do something. And I think we're doing it. We're doing it with our laws. We're doing it with the use cases that keep happening that helps us to fortify and improve those laws. But we've also got to do it with the conversations, the gatherings like these, individuals like yourselves, having more and more of these conversations. But I always say these conversations cannot stay in these rooms. We've got to move them out into the spaces where people need to truly understand that it's about civil rights. It's about your civil liberties. It's about human rights. It's about dignity. It's about respect. As you will not allow someone to come and extract a piece of your flesh, a piece of your, or just drain your blood while you're having a conversation with them. That's exactly what we're doing with data. It's like we're on our phones, we're on our computers, and we're giving our data. And it's like someone is just there draining. It sounds very vampire-ish, I'm sorry. But you get the idea. So it's something we need to think about, and you're quite correct when we think about data. The other question about data is the data that's been collected, that we do not even know what's been collected and what these companies have. And from what I have heard and what I have read, many of these big companies are only using about 20% or less of the data they've actually collected. So what are they doing what has been amassed? We may not be even here to figure that out. So a brilliant question. Thank you.
Thank you, Renée. Eu vou abrir para mais uma pergunta do público, então, por conta do avançar da hora, e já nos encaminhamos para as considerações finais da professora e para o encerramento.
Good morning. I have two questions. The first, em quem a senhora votou para presidente dos Estados Unidos? Na Kamala ou no Donald? E por quê? A segunda, Seguinte, a gente vive num mundo que vive dominado por redes sociais. Eu trabalhei 25 anos em pesquisa de mercado, então eu vejo como os dados são realmente manipulados. Inclusive, o atual presidente americano, ele usa os dados de modo errado. Por exemplo, antes de ontem, a diretora do FED foi demitida porque ele usou um dado real e manipulou esses dados para demiti-la. Inclusive, ele usa dados e joga isso na sua rede social. E como o povo não gosta de ler, não gosta de pesquisar, crê em tudo que ele fala. Realmente, não só a direita, mas a esquerda e outros grupos usam os dados manipulados. Como a gente que é leigo, não só a gente, mas o povo deve fazer para não acreditar em tudo que é dito por esse ou aquele outro personagem. Thank you.
Obrigada.
Oh, that first question, absolutely brilliant, right? Who did I vote for? I'm going to meet you after, and I'm going to whisper it in your ear, and you're going to tell me whether or not. Or maybe I can vote for you. I vote for you. I vote for you. And that question about data, is this. We have constantly got to interrogate data. There is nothing neutral about data. Many people believe because it's data, it's scientific, it's mathematical, it's statistical, but it still is not objective. I always say there is nothing called raw data. All data has been cooked in one way or another. That's why data carries with it this memory. Data's computational memory and data's cultural memory do not come together. So when it comes to how do we do that, it goes back to data literacy. It goes back to data literacy and the fact that questions such as data ethics, data justice, data rights, civil rights, human rights need to now be at the earliest level of our schooling. Some of us have the luxury, they say there are two educations, the one that you get from, the establishment, and the ones that you get from other, and the ones that you give yourself. And this is a moment that calls for three educations, right? The one that you get in your school, the formal one, the one that you give yourself, and the one that you need now to exist in this world of disinformation, distrust, deep fakes, but yet data is something so beautiful, something just so spectacular that we can do an extraordinary amount of good with this technology. If we are to reimagine this technology in a way in which we uphold dignity, in a way in which we respect rights, in a way in which we reimagine that respectful engagement, and in a way in which we think about everything that I want for myself, I want for you, and I want for you and every community. And I keep saying data and algorithms are about legacies, and that's what they do. They're creating a legacy, and we're going to have to ask ourselves, are we part of that? Are we part of the good, or are we part of the bad? And that's the sort of ambiguity and ambivalence of the technology as well. So it really comes down to data literacy, and I will continuously promote this area called public interest technology. We have got to bring the voice of the people into it, and that's the only way we can equalize the power structure called data.
Obrigada, Renée. Bom, estamos nos encaminhando para o final e eu gostaria de, na verdade, agradecer a Renée pelas respostas, pela brilhante palestra, pela presença. E eu acredito que foi um momento inspirador que vai finalizar, como último keynote do evento, de uma maneira muito importante para a proposta do seminário, que é nos fazer pensar, de maneira inclusive multidisciplinar, como encaminhar daqui para frente questões relacionadas à privacidade e proteção de dados, entendendo conceitos que para nós não estão postos e que estão em processo de construção. Justiça de dados, contornos relacionados a vieses discriminatórios, respostas de autoridades, como a nossa Autoridade Nacional de Proteção de Dados, para aspectos ainda anuviados relacionados à biometria. Nós tivemos recentemente uma consulta pública promovida por essa autoridade para que a população, como você trouxe, possa trazer contribuições técnicas para que a nossa autoridade possa desenhar diretrizes sobre bons usos éticos de biometria. Isso é só um exemplo do quanto nós podemos e precisamos desenhar contornos possíveis, cada vez mais democráticos, para entender o que, de fato, nós estamos falando quando endereçamos justiça de dados. Então, eu queria, na verdade, agradecer e reforçar isso que a Renée trouxe, de que existe memória no uso de dados pessoais, né? Não existe inteligência artificial sem uso de dados. E, então, a camada de proteção de dados é essencial e os contornos de proteção de dados são essenciais para nós, de fato, desenharmos os futuros que desejamos com o uso desses novos aparatos tecnológicos sem reproduzir antigas lógicas de opressão, agora com a roupagem desses novos aparatos. Então, agradecer a Renée mais uma vez pela brilhante palestra, agradecer a todos os interessados e, na qualidade de moderadora, encerrar a nossa participação nesse painel. Obviamente, Renée, se quiser fazer contribuições finais, pode ficar à vontade e encerramos.
My final comment would be thank you so very much, and Bianca, thank you very much to you. When we met in Miami at the Black Data Matter conference, Bianca said to me she was bringing me back to Brazil, and I'm here, and I just want to say that she is brilliant, but most of all, she's a woman of integrity, and I respect that, and I honor you, and Brazil should be very proud to have your kind of brilliance. You go, girl.
Renée, Bianca, thank you so much for this powerful keynote. I'd just like to invite you both for a photo. E para o resto do pessoal, vamos começar o nosso intervalo de almoço agora. Lembramos que temos opções de almoço aqui no evento mesmo e voltamos às 13h30 para o painel Sandbox Regulatório e Inteligência Artificial. Até mais tarde, pessoal.